Our first kiss is an intimate moment, a moment when we connect on an emotional level, a moment of sexual desire and passion, and a sign of love. We expose our desires and open ourselves up to another person, make ourselves vulnerable. A kiss is a way of abandoning oneself, a joining of two people. But in this painting by René Magritte, he takes the cinematic cliché but disrupts our voyeuristic pleasure by covering the faces in cloth. A moment of connection becomes one of isolation, of sexual frustration. An intimate moment becomes something dark and effortlessly disturbing, something hidden and anonymous. So many artists create myths around themselves, elaborate stories to make themselves seem more interesting. But René Magritte did the opposite. He created a persona that concealed his personality. He made himself invisible. For most of his adult life, Magritte hid behind the exterior of a respectable member of the bourgeoisie. Even the bowler hat he wore, that has now become so intrinsically linked to him, was adopted precisely because it was the uniform of Belgian civil servants. Apart from 3 years in Paris, he lived anonymously in the suburbs of Brussels his whole life, was married to the same woman for 45 years, and walked his Pomeranian dog at the same time every day. He had a lifelong obsession with detective novels and mysteries, and we can compare his outward conventionality to that of a secret agent, a subversive saboteur who avoids detection by dressing and behaving like everybody else, and then challenges conformity from within. He was born at the end of the 19th century in the nondescript town of Lessines in western Belgium. His father was a gambler and a drunk who owned a tailor's shop, and his mother was a milliner. Tailored suits and hats are reoccurring motifs in his paintings. As a child, Magritte and his friend played in an abandoned cemetery, and it was here that he saw a local artist painting at his easel. It was a critical moment, and he later said that he thought it was as if the artist had been given magic powers from above. He would later include granite tombs and wooden coffins repeatedly in his art. When Magritte was growing up, his mother had attempted suicide by trying to drown herself in the water tank in the family attic. She was then locked up in her bedroom for her own safety, but one night she managed to escape and threw herself into the nearby river where she drowned. When her body was eventually found, her nightdress had been dragged up over her naked body and was covering her face. Magritte refused to discuss his childhood, and according to his widow Georgette, he never spoke of death. In particular, he never mentioned the death of his mother. Given the circumstances of his mother's death, the river, the naked body and the shrouded face, it is hard to disassociate his childhood trauma from his paintings. But that's exactly what Magritte wanted us to do. Unlike the rest of the surrealists, psychology didn't interest Magritte, who avoided any in-depth interpretation of his work. And yet, it is ironic that he is the one artist who offers so much opportunity for armchair analysis. Is this deliberate detachment from his past memories another mask? In this rarely seen work, two pieces of text are connected. On the left, it translates as "a character losing memory," and on the right, it says "a woman's body." And this painting, for example, is based directly on the death mask of an unknown girl who drowned in the River Seine. There is no escaping that despite the humour of his work, it can also be deeply morbid and have an air of mourning. A happier childhood memory was when he was visiting a fairground at the age of 15. It was here that he met a beautiful young girl called Georgette, who in 1922 would become his lifelong wife. Magritte left home at 17 and moved to Brussels, and after studying at the Academy of Fine Arts there, he worked as a poster and advertising designer, whose clients included Alfa Romeo. Magritte's commercial art was almost certainly an influence on his paintings. And in the same way advertising condenses commercial concepts into one single image, Magritte does the same with his portrayal of the human condition. The advertising industry's use of reoccurring images and motifs can also be seen to have had an influence. And as with his commercial design, Magritte would employ a neat, flat finish in his art. Decades later, Andy Warhol, a fan of Magritte, would follow a similar career path, and his prints and paintings would be infused with evidence of his days as a commercial draftsman. In 1926, Magritte signed a contract with a gallery in Brussels, which made it possible for him to paint full-time. Around this time, he produced the first painting that he himself labelled as surrealism. Belgian critics hated his new work, and he decided to move somewhere where he would be appreciated. Surrealism began officially in 1924, with the Surrealist Manifesto, drawn up by André Breton, with the stated aim to liberate the mind by subverting rational thought and giving free rein to the unconscious. In 1927, Magritte moved to Paris to be closer to the French Surrealist group. His 3 years there would be the most prolific of his life, and The Lovers 2 would be created a year after he arrived in the city. Magritte became a leading member of the Surrealist group, but differed from the others in that he rejected Freudian ideology. And, as noted, he would always actively discourage any psychoanalytical reading of his work. He was never totally at home with the bohemian artists of Paris, preferring to keep away from their excessive lifestyle and heavy drinking. Determined to hang on to his outsider status, he took an apartment far out in the Paris suburbs, where he could work all day, and he and Georgette could have early nights. The Dadaists were the forerunners of the Surrealists, and their art was as much about writing as painting. Poetry, too, was a major part of Dadaism. This continued into Surrealism, and Magritte started experimenting with his own word paintings, which are some of his best-known works. The idea was to question the reality, but also the limitation of words and their visual representations, and look at the well-worn connections between the two. Maybe the simplest way to explain Magritte's word paintings is by using one of his most famous works, The Treachery of Images. Inscribed next to it is Ceci n'est pas une pipe, or This is not a pipe. This is of course true, because it is not a pipe, it is a painting of a pipe. You can't pick it up or smoke it. Words are arbitrary and unreliable, and he questions our trust in them. He is also questioning the very nature of art. It's an illusion. It's not a functional object. It's a signifier of an object. As with many of Magritte's works, on the surface they can pass as gags or whimsy, but they are also a profound meditation on the instability of meaning. Before we look at The Lovers 2, we can look at the methods Magritte used to make us see contradictions and irrational concepts. One method was to combine two familiar objects and make a new one. Another method was to paint a solid object as if it were a see-through portal. In some paintings, he would defy gravity and show heavy objects floating. He would give an unfamiliar name to a familiar object. He would change scale by making small objects huge and large objects impossibly tiny. Another method was to obscure or to hide a face or an object, setting up a conflict between the visible that is hidden and the visible that is present. Magritte did 4 versions of The Lovers in 1928, and in much the same way we saw how he subverts the expectations of language. In these paintings, he subverts the expectations of image. As with so many works by him, it is the removal of what we are expecting as a viewer, in this case intimacy, that creates a tension and anxiety in the work. On a simpler level, he is just playing with our natural human desire to always want to see what is hidden. One of the first things that sticks out to me with this painting is the ominous silence. In this unsettling image, which was the second in a series of 4 variations, Magritte does what he does best. He takes our familiar world, breaks it into pieces, and then reassembles it. Even though these figures are caught in such an intimate moment, we as a viewer don't get to witness it because they're not actually touching flesh. There's a barrier between them of suffocating fabric. On one level, it can be read as a representation of blind love. And on another, denied by Magritte, it could be seen to reference his dead mother's shrouded face when her body was found. We should also look at how the device of a covering or mask used to conceal a figure's identity corresponds to a larger surrealist interest in disguises and what lies beyond or beneath visible surfaces. As a viewer, it is frustrating because the lover's kiss is so familiar to us, and like Magritte's bowler-hatted man, the couple are nobody and everybody at the same time. The biggest contradiction with Magritte was between what he painted and how he painted it. Along with Dali, Magritte's work belongs to the naturalistic surrealists, in the sense that his scenes or objects are clearly recognizable representations, as opposed to, say, the more expressionistic surrealism. His style of painting is fairly dull and conventional. It is naturalistic, but completely banal, and his textures are equally flat and uninteresting, as we can see in this close-up. Every element in the painting is recognizable and realistically painted, but there is no specific style, no visible brushstrokes, and that's the point. The artist is not there. This was a deliberate choice on Magritte's part, as a way to have extreme contrast between the drabness of his style and the extraordinary subject matter. The relationship between the elements is what is important, and if the style doesn't attract attention, the irrationality of the image becomes even more shocking. Magritte had a peculiar method of working. When he was painting, he wore the same clothes he wore every day, that is, a bourgeois gentleman's business suit. He never had a studio, but worked in a corner of the living room of his home, which had wall-to-wall carpeting, which it was noticed was totally stain-free, and he worked quietly and alone. The truth is, Magritte didn't even like the painting process, which he referred to more than once as boring. It was the ideas that really interested him, that made him passionate, and transferring them onto canvas was just a chore. Interestingly, he also loathed going to art galleries and museums, and would rather look at reproductions of famous works. Magritte's early paintings were heavily influenced by Cubism, and when he first showed them, the critics were not impressed. The single most important event of his career happened in 1922, when he was shown a reproduction of Giorgio de Chirico's 1914 painting, The Song of Love, with its strange juxtaposition of a classical bust and a red rubber glove. It changed Magritte's life. Later, his own images would often reference de Chirico's manipulation of space and perspective, and he would sometimes use the same motifs in his own canvases. Like many of the surrealists, literature was an important influence on Magritte. In 1868, the poet Comte de Lautréamont wrote a book called The Songs of Maldoror, and Magritte did these extraordinary illustrations for the 1948 edition. The book was a major influence on the surrealist movement because it contained the phrase, "as beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table." A metaphor that captures one of the most important principles of the surrealist aesthetic. That is, the combination of two different or unrelated objects to challenge our preconditioned perception of reality. Edgar Allan Poe was one of Magritte's idols, and during his only trip to the US, he insisted on a visit to Poe's grave. Georgette Magritte recalls that he read and reread Poe's tales of mystery and imagination, and was inspired by the writer's literary experiments and his interest in the boundaries between rationality and irrationality. Magritte created several tributes to Poe's story, The Domain of Arnheim, which is the tale of a man who inherits $450 million and decides to use it to create a perfect landscape. Magritte's work too is concerned with the ideal landscape, and in this version, the natural is represented by the mountain and the eggs, and the artificial by the wall. In another reference to the writer, Magritte places a tattered copy of Poe's only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, on the mantelpiece of this painting, which, like the book, is concerned with duplicity. Magritte was also deeply engaged with the books of Lewis Carroll, and like many of his contemporaries, saw Alice in Wonderland as a precursor of surrealism. Carroll played with the perceptions of reality and made us re-evaluate our visual expectations. He played with contradictions of scale, and he used humour and whimsy to reveal deeper philosophical ideas.
I can't explain myself, I'm afraid. Because I'm not myself, you see. No, I don't see.
In the same way Alice leaps onto the fireplace and then passes through the mirror into Carroll's looking-glass world, Magritte's miniature locomotive emerges from another realm into our world. And finally, one of the most enduring of his inspirations was Fantomas.
Magritte, êtes-vous Fantomas?
C'est une très belle question.
As children, René and his brother Paul loved the cinema and were obsessed with the famous Fantomas film serials of 1913, based on a series of popular crime fiction books. Fantomas was a sinister anti-hero who often switched identity and was a masked criminal constantly at threat from being revealed. The character had a hidden dark side, perhaps more fascinating than their outward appearance. These would be concerns that Magritte addressed as an artist, and Fantomas would be the basis for several of his paintings. After 3 years in Paris, Magritte